Good afternoon. Welcome to this EFSA information session on the guidance document on risk assessment for birds and mammals. My name is Tobin Robinson. I will be your moderator for this afternoon session. I have been with EFSA for quite some years, since 2006. I'm currently the head of unit of EFSA's plants unit. That's the unit responsible for environment, plant health and ecotoxicology. This is following a recent, as in the 1st of April, reorganisation of our pesticide activities within EFSA. We have around 500 people registered for this afternoon session, so we see people joining at a very fast rate at the moment. As I indicated, we have a 3-hour session in front of us. We will have, if time permits, a very short break about halfway through this session, but we have an awful lot to get through, so let's get right to it. So if I could have the next slide, please. So this afternoon's session, as I mentioned, is about the update to the guidance on risk assessment for birds and mammals. This comes from a mandate received from the Commission asking us to update a guidance that was originally published back in 2009. This guidance was written on the back of an opinion from the PPR panel published back in 2008. As this guidance should be seen as an update, not a completely new document from those original guidance documents, we would suggest strongly that the original guidance document and its supporting opinion are referred to as background documents. Specifically, with the mandate received for the update for this guidance, we were asked to take into account Commission activities on defining specific environmental protection goals and review risk assessment guidance based on relevant specific protection goals agreed during this process. The update should be done in the light of the current regulations, in the light of new scientific knowledge, should also take into account feedback from member states and other stakeholders. We should take this as an opportunity to clarify the methodology used and provide guidance with harmonisation of higher tier assessments. And one of the activities related to this guidance document is to provide a calculator tool to assist with its implementation. Just to say that regarding the specific protection goals, no new protection goals were received during the drafting of this updated guidance, and therefore we refer to the ones that were used back in the guidance of 2009. This activity has been done on the back of launching a public consultation on the 209 guidance to collect feedback on what you, the stakeholders, would like to see being updated in this guidance document. And the next slide, please. As ever, with much of EFSA's work, this work has been drafted by a very active working group that I would like to take this opportunity to thank for their extensive efforts these last years. The working group, just to mention, also specifically included experts coming from member state competent authorities in order to ensure that the guidance was workable not only at the EU level, but also for our national authorities and their role in the authorization process. The next slide, please. So this afternoon, in the following 3 hours, this is what we're hoping to get through. The information session is organised principally around going through the main chapters of our guidance document. We will tackle it chapter by chapter, and at the end of each session dealing with the chapter, we will have a question and answer session. And the next slide, please. And of course, a brief wrap up at the end of the session. And the next slide, please. So a few housekeeping rules, just to remind you, this is an information session, so it is just a one-way audio. So you, the audience, will only be in listening mode. The event is in and exclusively in English. The questions and answers, the questions are taken from those received in the registration forms. So these have been selected and will be addressed by our presenters in the dedicated sessions on each chapter. The event is being recorded. The recording will be published shortly after this meeting, in a few days afterwards. So you will be able to revisit the content that's being shared with you today, but also it will be available to those of your colleagues who were not able to attend this live event. And just to say that after this event, you will receive by email a link to a survey to evaluate this event. It is a very important part of the process for us and helps us to improve the service that we provide to you. Thank you. So with that, let's get on to the content. I'm very happy to say that with us today for this information session, we have two of our experts who were heavily involved in the drafting of this document. So firstly, Dr. Theo Brook, who was the chair of the working group. I'm very happy to say he's with us today. He is a retired ecotoxicologist, previously working for Wageningen University in the Netherlands, and he has a background in aquatic ecotoxicology and a long history of working with EFSA on quite a range of topics, particularly those related to environmental risk assessment. Also with us today, very happy to say that we have Dr. Emily McVeigh. She's a toxicologist by education. During the drafting of the guidance document, she was working for the Netherlands Board for the Authorization of Plant Protection Products. Since then, she has moved to the RIVM in the Netherlands to take up a new role. She too has a long history of working with EFSA, both in the pesticide peer review area, also on the assessment of pesticides, but also in a variety of other working groups. So let's get to it. It is my great pleasure to hand you over to Theo Brook to take you through the introduction to the guidance document. Theo, please.
Okay, may I have next slide, please? The updated guidance document adopted the generalized tiered approach as developed by EFSA for environmental risk assessment of plant protection products. A fundamental aspect of the tiered approach is that every level of the assessment should be able to address the protection goals and the underlying effect assessment and exposure assessment goals. In principle, different effect and exposure assessment tiers may be linked to conclude on a risk characterization. If low risks cannot be concluded, risk management options may be selected to reduce the risks. In the updated guidance document, as said already, the operational protection goals of the previous guidance document are retained, but described now in line with recent EFSA recommendations on the definition of specific protection goals. In short, the operational protection goals and underlying effect assessment and exposure assessment goals of the updated guidance assume a sufficient level of protection of birds and mammals in agricultural landscapes if, in the acute dietary risk assessment, individuals of potentially sensitive species do not show mortality, and if, in the reproductive dietary risk assessment, populations of sensitive and vulnerable species do not decline in abundance. Note that important choices with respect to effect and exposure assessment goals are similar as in the previous guidance document. The focus is on direct toxic effects of exposure to individual plant protection products and not on indirect effects due to shifts in food availability of the use of pesticides. In addition, the focus is on dietary exposure only due to spray application, seed treatments and granules, and not on dermal and inhalation exposure. May I have the next slide, please? 4 types of birds and mammals are used in environmental risk assessment tiers. The screening tier exposure assessment makes use of the indicator model species. That is a virtual species that, by virtue of its size and feeding habits, is considered to have a worst-case internal exposure than all real species with different feeding guilds. In the Tier 1 and 2 exposure assessment, generic model species are used. Again, these species are not real species, but comprise realistic worst-case species from an internal exposure point of view that have a high food intake rate and representing a specific feeding guild and stratum where they feed in the crop. In more realistic refinements, such as the Tier 3 exposure assessments, and in the higher integrated exposure and effect assessment tier, focal species are considered. That are real bird and mammal species that actually occur in the crop and are differentiated in accordance with their feeding guild. And for focal species, a mixed diet is considered when appropriate. In the lower tier effect assessment, standard test species are used. That are real bird and mammal species used in standardized and legally prescribed laboratory toxicity tests. May I have the next slide, please? In the effect assessment, 4 different tiers are distinguished. Note that with increasing tier, both the ecological realism and the complexity of the assessment increases. The lowest effect assessment tier, the screening tier, uses conservative surrogate toxicity data for birds and mammals, for instance, in case no experimental toxicity data are available for standard test species and certain metabolites. Effect assessment tier 1 is based on laboratory toxicity data for a limited number of prescribed standard test species. This tier currently is the main effect assessment approach due to the European Union scope to reduce tests with vertebrates. In the rare case that also for additional bird and mammal species valid laboratory toxicity data are available, effect assessment tier 2 can be used. Information for additional species may, for instance, be available as part of the dossier requirements outside the European Union. The highest tier concerns the integrated exposure and effect assessment tier. For instance, in the form of field effect studies and or spatially explicit exposure and effect modeling with focal species. Note that in this tier, zonal and or member state specific studies may be required. May I have the next slide, please? In the exposure assessment, 5 tiers are distinguished. The lowest tier concerns the screening tier based on a dietary dose calculated for the indicator model species described in a previous slide. The Tier 1 exposure assessment is based on the dietary dose calculated for the generic model species and the worst-case exposure scenario in the form of the food that they consume. Tier 3 exposure assessment is based on the dietary dose calculated for selected focal species by refining ecological data of vulnerable species at risk, such as the proportion of the animal's diet obtained in in-field area of the crop and the composition of the diet of the selected focal species that are the so-called PT and PD studies. I noticed I forgot exposure assessment tier 2. That is also based on dietary dose calculated for generic model species, but by refining pesticide residue data in their food. Again, the highest tier concerns the integrated exposure and effect assessment tier already discussed in the previous slide. The most relevant tiers will be discussed in greater detail later on in the presentation. May I have the next slide, please? In general terms, the risk assessment will be based on a toxicity exposure ratio, except in the case of the higher integrated exposure and effect assessment tier. In the acute dietary risk assessment, the toxicity exposure ratio should be equal or larger than 10 to conclude low risks. In the reproductive dietary risk assessment, the toxicity exposure ratio should be equal or larger than 5. The results of the risk assessment obtained from a valid higher integrated exposure and effect assessment tier may be directly compared with the operational protection goal, but an exposure multiplication factor may need to be applied to address remaining uncertainties. I give now the floor to Emily for further details on effect assessment approaches and endpoint selection.
Great, thank you so much, Theo, for that really nice start and overview of the risk assessment. So, as Theo mentioned, I'm now going to discuss some of the updates to Chapter 5 of the revised guidance, which is the effects section. Next slide, please. So, as I'm certain most of you are likely already aware, a major change from the 2009 guidance is that we've moved from a so-called no effect level to an effect level 10, which we've recommended to be a benchmark dose 10. The many reasons to use an effect level rather than a NOEL in the risk assessment are mentioned in the revised guidance document, as well as in both the previous and current EFSA guidances on benchmark dose modeling and numerous publications. The working group decided to make the change in order to better align with Regulation 1107, which notes 10% as a key effect level in ecotoxicology, and with other guidances making use of effect level 10%. However, the major reason for the change to a specific effect level is to lower uncertainty and improve understanding of the results of the risk assessment, in line with the current state of the science on risk assessment. Naturally, there are cons to almost every option, and in the case of the benchmark dose 10, these include the fact that the reproductive risk assessment includes a number of different endpoints, and the end result of a 10% increase or decrease in any of these may have different overall population effect between one or the other. To some degree, this is also addressed in the exposure assessment, which will be discussed later, but it's acknowledged that the current state of the science does not allow a tailored effect level of relevance for population survival for each possible endpoint. In addition, of course, users will have to learn a new process and skill in order to use benchmark dose modeling. Next step, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, as to how to calculate the effect level 10 or BMD 10, the working group has made reference to the newest EFSA BMD guidance, noting that the most recent EFSA BMD guidance should always be considered. So when it's updated, you can consult the new benchmark dose guidance. However, regarding the Bayesian approach and the use of priors, the working group and the guidance states that these should only be used when agreed upon by authorities and do not have to be considered when a frequent approach already determines quality BMD. The guidance provides information on how to determine the quality of the BMD in the form of a decision tree and considering the benchmark, the lower limit of the benchmark dose and the upper limit of the benchmark dose. Next slide, please. Okay, so when it's not possible to determine a quality benchmark dose using the frequentist approach or the Bayesian approach, or acceptable priors do not allow attempts using a Bayesian approach, the guidance recommends using the NOEL. Some additional guidance has been given based upon the publication of Green et al. In 2022 for NOEL calculation, and references also made to the statistical considerations in the most recent EPA guidance for reproduction studies in birds. It is noted that additional vertebrate testing should not be performed. Indeed, the use of the benchmark dose is specifically included as it may allow estimation of a 10% effect level when fewer replicates are available. Next slide, please. So now we've covered the change in the actual endpoint to be used or the effect level, and we can move on to the ecologically relevant endpoint for mammals. Next slide, please. So in the years since the adoption and implementation of EFSA 2009, it has become more clear that the expansive dataset in the mammalian toxicology section allows for a significant number of potential endpoints for the wild mammals risk assessment, but not all of these endpoints can be considered ecologically relevant. The protection goal for wild mammals is, as mentioned by Teo, is the population level rather than the individual level, which is the protection goal for the human health risk assessment. EFSA 2009 recommended endpoints only from reproduction and developmental toxicity studies, specifying that OECD guidances followed for these studies. Although these studies will likely continue to provide the most relevant endpoints for the wild mammal risk assessment, it was noted by the ecotoxicology experts that other mammalian endpoints in the mammalian toxicology dataset also contain similar or the same endpoints, suggesting those should be considered as well. Additionally, other studies may be available which also measure relevant endpoints. However, the familiarity of the ecotoxicology assessors with the mammalian toxicology dataset and studies is variable. Next slide, please. To that end, the working group has provided a list of all required or potentially required studies as of today, summarizing the general conduct of each and the endpoints which are measured. For some studies, including the developmental toxicology and neurotoxicology studies, an expanded consideration of the measured endpoints is provided, as these endpoints may vary significantly, and depending on those observed, measured, may be more or less relevant. This section is found in Appendix C of the revised guidance. Perhaps most importantly, the working group has also provided significant guidance on the types of endpoints present in the mammalian toxicology dataset that may be considered to be ecotoxicologically relevant, and why or why not. In order to do this, toxicological and ecotoxicological knowledge was used, as well as experience and publications related to this matter. In section 5.2.6.5, the working group attempted to address all the possible endpoints and focus on those that have resulted in discussion or disharmony in the past. However, of course, each situation is specific to the substance in question, and expert judgment will nevertheless be required. Reproduction and developmental endpoints are generally considered to be ecotoxicologically relevant, as in EFSA 2009, with some considerations which will be discussed shortly. Other types of endpoints based on organ-level effects and non-endocrine organs, biomarkers, or carcinogenicity were considered non or less relevant. Next slide, please. So some studies were considered to be of lower relevance, such as 28 and 90-day studies and studies in dogs, with screening studies being irrelevant for endpoint setting. Each of these may nevertheless be relevant for supporting the choice of similar or related endpoint from another study or for mechanistic considerations. Next slide, please. Finally, the working group attempted to address known areas of difficulty due to a clear division between the endpoints considered for the human health risk assessment and those that would be relevant for ecotoxicology, including the prevalence and severity of effects and considerations of the age of the animals and the exposure length. The latter is most applicable when considering endpoints from chronic or carcinogenicity tests, where the lifetime exposure and age of onset of effects should be carefully weighed, and many endpoints may be considered less relevant for those reasons. Furthermore, it is noted that some severe effects may be considered by the human toxicology section, even if they are very rarely present or cannot be certain that they are treatment related, when compared to historical control data, for example. This is due to the need to protect individuals from these types of severe effects in the human health risk assessment. However, as the protection goal in ecotoxicology is the population, these types of effects would not be considered population relevant when only present at very low prevalence. The example, as you can see here, is hydrocephaly, which is a rare and very severe effect, but may not be relevant for ecotox depending on prevalence. If only a very few pups are affected, despite its severity, it would not be considered ecologically relevant, as the loss of relatively few pups is not expected to significantly impact the population. And furthermore, there's no need to use extreme precaution as in the human health risk assessment for these types of severe effects and protection of the individual. Next slide, please. So in addition to the technical considerations in section 5.2.6.5, the working group has provided a tabular format to be used when presenting reproductive endpoints. This is just a small piece of the table in the guidance, which contains fictitious examples to clarify the columns and rows and the types of things that can be reported there. Next slide, please. So, moving from mammals to birds. As a result of recent publications and comments during the stakeholder consultation preceding the revision of the guidance document, the working group specifically addressed the question of the coverage of migratory birds in the risk assessment. This is questioned from the perspective of toxicological sensitivity due to the neurological and metabolic systems present in migrating species versus the tested species of birds. Next slide, please. So first, it's recommended to check in the mammalian dataset for known neurotoxic effects, which the literature and ecotoxicological knowledge suggests may be particularly detrimental to migrating birds. Next slide, please. To address this potential, it may first be checked whether acute data in passerine species are available and whether these result in comparable endpoints. It should be emphasized once again that no additional testing is recommended, but it may be that in other jurisdictions, these data are required and may thus be available in the data set. Next slide, please. If no passerine data is available, or if it's considered the passerine data may not sufficiently cover the potential risk, the level at which effects important for migrating species, so neurotoxic or primary significant body weight effects, are seen. Next slide, please. These can be compared with the endpoints for birds from the usual reproduction studies, checking to see where the level of effect is seen. Next slide, please. When all of these have been compared and the evidence is weighed, if it is determined that there is a potential for effects which would be more detrimental for migratory species and are not covered by the endpoints from the toxicity studies available, the experts may consider whether an additional factor to address this uncertainty should be added. So an additional assessment factor, or for example, the use of the lower limit of the benchmark dose. Next slide, please. So next we'll go to something which is within the effects section because it is based on the effects information, but of course is also part of the exposure assessment, and that is the use of the time-weighted average exposure level in the risk assessment, which in the Birds and Mammals risk assessment is represented by the FTWA, or the factor, time-weighted average factor. So in EFSA 2009, the FTWA is basically always used in the reproductive risk assessment. The working group revised the policy for using the TWA exposures in the risk assessment based on the state of the science and risk assessment, comments during the stakeholders' consultation prior to the revision, and alignment with other risk assessment guidances, such as the aquatic guidance of 2013. Next slide, please. So furthermore, a footnote on page 34 of the EFSA 2009 notes that it is intended to develop further guidance on criteria for determining which effects could be caused by short-term exposures. So that's actually exactly what the working group decided to do. So we considered the types of toxicities which can most reliably be assumed to be as a result of long-term exposures. Body weight is a very common example, which is also a potentially ecotoxicologically relevant endpoint. Whereas primary effects on reproduction or development would be those that are most likely to be potentially as a result of exposure at critical time points. In addition, primary effects on endocrine organs are included, as these may in the end directly affect development and reproduction. Please note that this is a decision tree provided for ease of use and clarity, but it does not replace the text accompanying the decision scheme. In addition, it's assumed that consideration will have already been made as to which effect endpoints from the dataset could be considered to be ecotoxicologically relevant. In the following slides, so this is the Mammal decision scheme, and in the following slides, the working group has worked through a few actual cases. The names of the substances have changed for data protection reasons. However, we'd like to run through those examples now. Next slide, please. So here, maybe just good to note that where the no is highlighted in pink, that's because we've said, according to the available data set, that it's not possible to use the time-weighted average exposure, because in those examples, there's been no possibility of submitting further argumentation or investigation of a mechanism of action to support the effects being potentially as a result of long-term exposure. So that no is still tentative, as it is stated in the guidance that that type of information may be submitted to support the use of the FTWA. So as you can see, a very important factor in whether or not to use the FTWA is related to whether there are reproductive or developmental effects, but it is noted that these should be primary effects. So in the ENI example, the critical endpoints include clear reprodevelopmental effects, early resorption and post-implementation loss in a rabbit study, as well as litter weight, stillbirths, and deaths in the multi-generation study in rats. However, all of these effects occurred at the same doses where there were clear toxic effects on parent generations, including mortality, significant weight loss, and clinical signs. Thus, these reprodevelopmental effects would be considered secondary to general parental toxicity and therefore not likely to have been caused by exposure at a critical time point. So the FTWA can be used. In the MENI example, we've separated two endpoints for clarity because they follow different lines in the decision scheme. The first is increased pup mortality postpartum in the absence of effects on the parental generation. In this case, this is a primary developmental effect, and the FTWA could not be used. The other endpoint, which was at the same exposure level, was pup body weight reduction. In this case, the scheme would go through until the question of whether there is another relevant endpoint in the same dose range, which is a reproductive effect. And there the answer was yes. So the end answer becomes no use of the FTWA for the MENI example. Next slide, please. In the mining example, there is again a potentially relevant reproductive effect. However, at the same dose, there were significant parental effects, including body weight reduction and reduction in food consumption. So the effects were considered to be secondary to general toxicity in the parent generation and not as a result of exposure at a critical time point. In Mo, the story is similar, but with different effects. As in the meanie example, the effects on reproduction are significant. However, they are accompanied by very significant toxicity in the parental generation, including mortality of the dams. Next slide, please. In the CACHA example, critical endpoints were body weight reduction. Generally, body weight reductions are due to long-term exposures, and while there were some developmental effects in a similar dose range, these were secondary to effects of dam toxicity, and the FWA can be used. In Tiger, there are clear reproduction and development effects, but they co-occur with significant dam effects once again. This example is included because whilst body weight gain and reduced food consumption in the absence of body weight or other effects are not in and of themselves considered to be ecologically relevant endpoints, they may nevertheless be indicative of significant general toxicity in dams when trying to determine whether an effect may be primary or secondary. It's also important to note that often the toxicology section can be consulted or will have already noted when effects may be secondary or primary, as this is also necessary for CLP evaluations in the human toxicology section. So next slide, please. And now we can move on to the decision scheme for birds. Once again, this is a decision scheme which is added for ease of use, but is not a replacement for the text that accompanies the decision scheme. And you'll note that in this decision scheme, the mammalian data set weighs rather heavily. This will be discussed further in the slides to come. Furthermore, it should be noted that the LD50/10 and the parental effects prior to egg laying are both intended to cover the types of effects which result from short-term exposure that would impair reproduction, including things like pair forming. So this would be an example of this would be significant or severe clinical signs. Next slide, please. So here we have the exact same substances, and we've run through them also for the birds. In the ENI example, although the FTWA is used in mammals, the critical effect in the bird reproduction study is eggshell thinning. Although there are, of course, other mechanisms for eggshell thinning, it is one of the best known mechanisms of action for short-term exposure can be sufficient. Therefore, the default assumption is that a direct effect at a critical time point may be possible, and the FTWA cannot be used without further data to support a different mechanism of action. In the meanie example, the FTWA is not used in mammals, which would weigh heavily towards not using the FTWA in birds. However, I'll go through the decision scheme as it continues in this case, because apart from the consideration of the effects observed in the MemTox dataset, the effects in the dataset for birds in this case would also support the use of a peak rather than a TWA exposure. In this case, the pathology data indicate an effect which could be as a result of short-term exposure to the parental generation, that is ovary regression. This shows how actually the mammalian dataset can be very useful when contextualizing effects seen in the bird reproduction study. Reduced 14-day-old survivors as a percentage of hatchlings may also be considered to be a potential developmental effect. However, taken together with the ovary regression, it becomes clear that there could be a mechanism which was based on more short-term parental exposure in play. However, even without the ovary regression having been measured, as it is often not at this point, the weight of evidence for the effects on chick survival, taken together with the fact that the FTWA was not used in the mammals based on the same or similar effects, strengthens the argumentation to use peak concentrations. In Miney and Mo, the critical effects are on egg production and viability and chick body weight. In both cases, similar effects were seen in the mammalian dataset and were related to parental generation or general toxicity. The same can be assumed in this case, where it is most likely that these effects are as a result of parental toxicities from longer-term exposure than exposure at a critical reproductive or developmental stage. Again, the use of the FTWA in the mammalian dataset and the effects that were observed there help to contextualize the critical effects in the bird studies. Next slide, please. In the CACHA example, all of the effects are observed post-egg laying, and there's no indication of effects prior to egg laying. Effects on chicks are not consistent. In addition, the mammalian data did not indicate any delayed effects or endocrine activity. As a result, the FTWA can be used. And finally, in the tiger example, there is a reduction in almost all measured parameters. Taken together with indications from a mammalian dataset, it can be assumed that systemic toxicity is in play rather than a specific effect as a result of exposure at a critical time point. So I think you can see from these examples that contrary to the concern that using the decision or the information from the mammalian toxicity section may result in additional conservativeness, the consideration of the effects in the more complete data set from mammals allow a better understanding of the effects in the bird studies and a more appropriate overall decision. And with that, I think I've probably talked for long enough, so I'll hand the floor back to Tobin.
Thank you very much, Emily, for taking us through chapter 5 of this guidance document. We have 3 questions on this chapter received from the registered participants. And so I'd like to take you through those questions, and if you can answer them, that will be fantastic. So first of our questions is it possible to use FTWA for birds when one has not been used for mammals? Secondly, when using the FTWA in bird risk assessments, which bird reproduction study endpoints are considered to indicate an effect on chick development? And then the final part of this first question is for both birds and mammals, what type and severity of parental effects are sufficient to justify using the FTWA in the risk assessment when a reproductive or developmental effect has also occurred at the same dose or concentration? Emily, please.
Great, thank you very much, Tobin. So this question is a bit of a difficult one because it's not possible to define the scope of potential effects or endpoints that may be seen in a reproduction study of birds, and certainly not in mammals. However, I would say in the presentation I attempted to provide a few examples, and I would say that generally, if an applicant wants to argue that an effect which normally falls under the category of not using the FTWA is nevertheless the result of study of tested dose, and there are no indications of cumulative toxicity or endocrine disruption, for example, in the mammalian data set, it would be possible to use the FTWA in the birds risk assessment. As to what types of endpoints are indicative of issues with chick development, in the case of the currently measured endpoints, these would mainly be survival and viability.
Hi, Emily, could you repeat the last part of your answer? Unfortunately, we've lost your sound.
Oh yes, I'm sorry, where did you lose me?
We had the complete answer for the first part of the question, but for the second 2, we had some interruptions.
Okay, great. I'll start with the second part then. So as to what types of endpoints are indicative of issues with chick development, in the case of the currently measured endpoints, these would mainly be survival or viability. When measured, clinical signs could be included in this as well. However, it's possible that other endpoints will be measured or will become important in certain cases. We didn't write the guidance document with the view that it would become obsolete if toxicity tests are updated. So potentially other types of endpoints will be measured in the future. Generally speaking, whether or not the endpoint can be considered primary or secondary will have to be considered by the mammalian toxicology section, as this is a key point in consideration for determining repro and developmental points of departure in the risk assessment. There's no hard and fast rule, but most commonly, and I attempted to show this in the examples, these types of effects on parents would include significant body weight loss or body weight gain changes, i.e. greater than 10%, and or feeding or clinical signs. These should be very prevalent in the parental generation and severe enough to indicate intoxication.
Okay. Very good, thank you for question 2. So how does the guidance cover substances that are endocrine disruptors? Emily, please.
Sure. So this guidance does not cover endocrine disruption properties specifically. There's another EFSA guidance document published in 2018, which specifically addresses how to determine whether a substance meets the criteria for endocrine disruption. If, according to this guidance, a substance is an ED, then you should propose a negligible exposure assessment. The only link between the two guidances is when considering, for example, whether the FTWA can be used and considering an investigation of toxic mechanism of action. Information and experience from the ED assessment may be used to advise the mechanism of action argumentation for TWA justifications.
Excellent, very good. And our third question to Emily as well. Quite a few parts to this one. So firstly, the revised guidance document gives more guidance how to select the relevant mammal endpoint. However, there is still a lot of expert judgment involved. Then, in addition, the preferred benchmark dose endpoint adds more uncertainty on what the final endpoint will be. The predictability is low, is the suggestion. Especially some further clarity on the benchmark dose approach would be helpful in this respect. For example, which endpoints to select for the calculations, and should we focus on the significant ones? For the body weight, should we focus on the most pronounced time point? How to do prior setting? And again, finally, are there any further activities planned in this regard? Emily, please.
Great, thanks, Tobin. That is a long one. I'll try to be clear but succinct in my answer. So thank you for the question. I think indeed expert judgment can't be avoided in most cases when you're talking about deriving toxicity endpoints and also calculating those. So it's really lucky that we are experts who are using this guidance. As far as endpoints, as mentioned in the guidance, the lowest endpoint should be selected for BMD calculation. Often there will be several potentially related endpoints which are in the same range, and therefore calculation for each endpoint would be needed to determine the appropriate BMD10. In some cases, it may be that endpoints in the same range are not equally able to be modeled, in which case those endpoints that result in the most reliable BMD within the same range could be chosen. For body weight, indeed, the most pronounced time point would be appropriate. However, if the body weight changes greater than 10% were present at multiple time points and in the same range, the same process as above would apply. As to the use of priors when determining the benchmark dose, as I mentioned before, and as recommended in the guidance, in the first instance, priors should not be used. This will result in basically a frequentist approach. If priors are necessary in order to determine an acceptable BMD, those can be discussed with the RMS experts in EFSA. We can't estimate exactly on how many occasions this will be necessary. However, there was an EFSA publication from 2015 and comparing the effect level 10 and NOEL, and in that case, the effect level 10 could be calculated in 97% of cases overall. In the overall data set. And within that data set, there was a very good representation of mammalian data, which was probably the overwhelming data, and also a good representation of bird data. So that suggests that a quality 10% effect level should be able to be calculated in the majority of cases. And of course, that was done not using the Bayesian approach or using priors. Considering that generally benchmark dose modeling is more appropriate for toxicity studies, such as those of birds and mammals, where there are fewer animals and fewer replicates and fewer doses, we would expect that it would be slightly higher for BMDs using the frequentist approach. This would mean that on relatively fewer occasions would it be necessary to, or advised to include priors, which would have to be discussed with the RMSs or EFSA. So the current BMD guide, sorry, it's a long question, long answer. So just to note that the BMD guidance, including the use of priors, is not specific to the Birds and Mammals guidance, and therefore any future work would be coordinated by the working group on BMD by EFSA. However, we've heard that the methodology and scientific support unit of EFSA is considering a follow-up activity specifically related to the use of priors and development of a priors repository of some kind. So, and with that, I'm finished with that one. Thanks so much, Tobin.
Emily, thank you very much for those clarifications. That's been very helpful. With that, we move to the next chapter for consideration, chapter 6 on exposure assessment tiers. And I'm very happy to welcome to the floor Rachel Sharp. Rachel is one of our staff members. She's been with EFSA for more than 12 years. with a focus on ecotoxicology, particularly in the peer review area and those activities associated with that. And in the context of this particular piece of work, Rachel was the coordinator for the production of this guidance document. So Rachel, please, over to you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Tobin. Thanks to Emily and Teo for their presentation so far. So yes, as Tobin has mentioned, I will go through the chapter 6, which is the exposure assessment tiers for the screening tier 1 and tier 2. I should explain that I'm going to try and focus mainly on the changes between the current guidance and the new guidance. So I'm sorry if those of you who are connected are not familiar with the old guidance. So some of the jargon you might come across. Okay, so next slide, please. So just to recap, so for the spray applications, as Teo has already explained, we have 3 types of species. So we have 2 model species. So for the screening level, we would use an indicator model species. For the tier 1, still a model species, but it's a generic model species. And then in the tier 3, we would start to use the focal species. So next slide, please. Okay, so for the screening level assessment, we're using the indicator model species, as I previously mentioned, but we have 3 very broad crop groups, and you just need to select a single indicator model species for each of those crop groups, and that would cover each the acute for birds and mammals and the reproduction for birds and mammals. And the characteristics of the indicator model species, so the body weight and the diet, are selected by taking the worst case of the generic model species that will be used in the tier 1 for the within that group of crops. So it's the worst case of the generic model species for tier 1, except we would also assume a single diet item. So there's no mixed diet in the screening level assessment. In terms of actually performing the assessment, all the values are actually fixed, and they're summarised in table 11 of the guidance document. And the point of the screening assessment is to screen out those substances that are clearly low risk. So to get rid of those ones that you don't need to worry about in the tier 1 and tier 2 assessment. And it also allows for extrapolation between crops. So when you have a GAP, a gap containing multiple crops, but with the same application rate, you can easily perform your assessment. So next slide, please. So you will see here the equations for the acute and reproductive screening assessment. They are actually identical to what was included in the 2009 version of the guidance document. They might appear slightly different, but they've just been expressed more appropriately. So you can see that the food intake rate is a fixed value, and it's given in the table 11, like I've already explained, and so is the body weight. You will need the application rate, which you just take from the gap table, and the RUD value. Again, that's fixed and is in the guidance document. The MAF value and the MAF reproduction value times FTWA, those values will need to be calculated. I will come on to that a bit more in the tier 1 on how you do that. But just to say that they will be calculated, but they will be calculated either using the calculator tool or which can also perform the screening assessment completely, or you can just use the tool to calculate those values individually. Okay, next slide, please. So moving on to the tier 1 for spray applications. So the equation is more or less the same as you have for the screening level assessments. So I've grayed out the parameters that I've already discussed. So the key differences are that at this level you can start taking into account mixed diet. So you'll see that the factor PD is taken into account, and we need to sum the exposure values for each of the food items to get an overall dietary dose or daily dietary dose for each of the generic model species. The other difference at this level is that you can start taking into account deposition values. So where a crop is to intercept some of the application rate to prevent some of the substance reaching the dietary items of the bird or mammal, then we can take that into account in the exposure estimation. And I will say a bit more about that later on. For completeness, you will see in the reproductive daily dietary dose calculation, we have also included the PT value. However, we don't use the PT value in the tier 1. However, these equations are consistent with the tier 2, so it was necessary to present that just for completeness. So next slide. And that's just to say that you can just ignore PT for the tier 1 assessment. Okay, so for the crop groups for the tier 1 assessment for sprays, during the public consultation we had on the first guide, on the current version of the guidance document, there were a number of requests from the stakeholders to be more comprehensive with the crop groups because there was a few crops that were missing. So what we've done is we have aligned to the EPO global database for crops, and that has given us 62 crop groups, 62 options. It was necessary to modify the crop groups ever so slightly to be a bit more tailored for birds and mammals. For example, we specify whether it's winter sown cereals or spring sown cereals. But as you can probably see from the 62 crop groups that we have extensive coverage, and they're summarised in Appendix E, together with some guidance on if you do come across a crop that is not included in the 62 options, then how you can tackle that, what you should think about when you come across that, and how you should select a surrogate crop group. Okay, so next slide, please. Oh yeah, so just to say on ornamental, so those of you who have been using the current guidance document, you will know that ornamentals causes a headache for many of the risk assessors. So what we have done to clarify that, so the reason it causes a headache is because ornamentals are an incredibly diverse group, and we never know what to assume in the assessment. So what we've done to provide more guidance is we've split the ornamental crop group into 8 separate subcategories, and within those subcategories there are some specificities that you can take into account. So next slide, please. So for the ornamental herbaceous plants, it turns out that whether they include bulbs or bulb-like plants, so tulips, daffodils, etc., has an impact on how you assess them in the exposure assessment. So what we've done is we have split the EPO crop group ornamental herbaceous plants into those that contain bulbs, those that don't contain bulbs, and specifically if you only have bulbs in your gap. Okay, so next slide. And then finally, to say if the applicant does not specify the type of ornamental, then we have to assume that they want their product to be used on all types of ornamental plants. Now this means essentially that you will have to assume worst case exposure parameters. So I would highly recommend that an applicant is more specific in their gap. And if indeed that they do want to cover all the types of ornamentals, then still to separate them into different crop groups or to have different lines of the gap table will allow the risk assessment to be more specific for each of those types, and you may end up with different conclusions. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so back to the generic model species. So the generic model species used for the tier 1 assessment. Again, it's not a real species, it's still a model species. The working group spent a lot of time and effort checking the coverage of the generic model species and ensuring that they were sufficient for all of the crop groups. Primarily, the generic model species were selected to be protective of all the focal species that may visit that group of crops. So the characteristics are that the body weight is low and the diet is a reasonably worst case. So the diet would be a mixed diet, taking into account the likely food that the animal will consume, the food availability, and I think that's everything actually. Okay, so The other aspects for the generic model species is that you need to calculate the food intake rate. So that will depend on what the animal is consuming and the various energy content of the diet items. Now, there is an appendix on how to do that, but if you want to cheat, you can look at Annex E, and Annex E contains the food intake rate for all the generic model species with all the mixed diets used in the Tier 1. So the generic model species are chosen from 6 feeding gills, as you can see, both for birds and mammals, covering all these types. But what I should say is that although they are defined as frugivorous and insectivorous, actually most of the animals that we consider are omnivorous to a certain extent or a certain time of year. So, for example, it's better to consider them as a species that consume a high proportion of that food item in their diet. So for the frugivorous, we're not talking about a purely frugivorous animal. We're talking about an animal that will take a lot of fruit at the time of year when that fruit is available. Okay, next slide. Okay, so for the food intake rate, just to say that this is the equation, you will see that it's identical to that was included in the EFSA 2009 guidance. The only difference is that we have clarified which of the parameters should be used for each of the generic model species, and you will find them in Appendix G. So everything is identical other than it's clear what values you should use for your Tier 1 generic model species. Okay, next slide. So selecting the generic model species and its characteristics. Don't be afraid of this slide, it seems quite detailed, but it's just to say that there is no, it's not an appendix, it's an annex. Annex B contains a spreadsheet containing 13 separate worksheets. And in those 13 worksheets, you can see that there are 7 which are relevant for selecting the generic model species for birds and mammals for spray applications. And the reason that they're split into 7 was just to make it more manageable and just to manage the size of the worksheet. So you can see down the bottom, you can select whichever type of crop you are looking at, and they're just split into the arable type, the tree and bush type, other types. And then there's a special consideration for mammals in the tie, but I will explain what that is later on. Okay, so you can select your worksheet. Next slide, please. And once you're within your worksheet, you can use the filtering tool in Excel, and that will help you identify the generic model species that you need to assess in your Tier 1 assessment. So if you are to filter for the crop that you want to assess, the growth stage range, so the BBCH growth stage, which will also be in the gap. And then for anything that is a tree and bush, you can also select the direction of the spray. So whether it's directed to the tree or bush, or whether you're treating the ground underneath the crop. Okay, so once you have selected your input, you can then use this column, which is very, very small, but it says inclusion or exclusion. So if you just take out the E's for exclusion, you will be left with the generic model species that you need to assess for that crop. You will also be able to see the body weight of the generic model species and the diet that generic model species consumes. And next to the diet, you will also see the location of the diet item, so whether it's on the crop, on the ground, or whether it's on the weed. And these are needed, this information is needed for selecting the deposition values, which I'll come on to later. And I think that's all I wanted to say on selecting the generic model species. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so for the residues, so for the concentration on the food item that the animal will take, the RUD values that were used in the EFSA 2009. You can see those in the left-hand side of the table. But what we did back in 2018, we had a procurement where we asked the contractors to systematically collect all of the available residue information for all these food items from the literature. They also search for information in the applicant dossiers for EU level assessments and some additional product registration dossiers used in the member states. So it was very comprehensive. And from that, and then they evaluated that data according to strict quality criteria. So we can be very assured that all the data used are to a certain quality standard. And so from that, we produced a database. And from that database, we could derive the 90th percentile acute value for value to be used in the acute assessment, and the geometric mean to be used in the reproductive assessment. And the working group selected the geometric mean as opposed to the arithmetic mean in the previous guidance document. And that was to select to have less influence on the extreme values. So that's a small change, but there's a good reason for it. So as you can see, comparing the RUD values, I've only presented the mean values here, but comparing the RUD values from the 2009 guidance document to the 2023 guidance document, you can see that for all of the food items, the RUD values have decreased, but they should not be considered to be less conservative, because you can also see that the sample size has increased substantially. So we have much more data available, and you can see that the values have gone down. The exception is for the ground seeds and the crop seeds, for which there was insufficient data available to make a suggested change to the guidance document. So those values from the 2009 guidance have been maintained, and the applicants and the stakeholders might like to take note that you can see that the RUD values used for those ground seeds and crop seeds are indeed quite high, and so that would be quite a nice refinement of the Tier 1 values for future, or indeed in the Tier 2 assessment. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so during the drafting of the guidance document, CropLife Europe provided us a large data set of residue values in fruit, and that was evaluated by my colleague, and from that a database for residue values in fruit was derived. And you can see that the data set was very extensive, so very large sample sizes, and because of that we could be more specific in the types of fruit and the RUD values derived. So you can see that again the values are all going down, but the sample size is substantially bigger. Okay, next slide please. Okay, so for the deposition values, what we have done there is we have clarified and simplified the deposition values to be used, and they are presented in Appendix L of the guidance document, and there's also a lookup table where you can filter in Annex D of the guidance document. So that's an Excel spreadsheet where you can filter for your crop and then see the deposition values you need to use for each of the growth stages. So the deposition values have been consolidated, and they are specified for each of the 62 Tier 1 crop groups. So there's complete clarity there. But what I should say is that we did not have data for all of the crop groups. So in some cases we needed to use a surrogate value. And what I should say is when we've used a surrogate value, the applicants may like to propose a more appropriate value in their assessment if, for example, their gap is more specific than the crop groups. So I haven't explained that well, but what I'm trying to say is that the crop groups are a group of crops, and if you only have one of the crops within that crop group, you can be more precise on the deposition value to be used in the Tier 1 assessment. So the deposition values that have been selected by the working group should be conservative of all the crops within the crop group, but you can propose an alternative if you wish. But if you do propose an alternative, it's important that it's aligned to the deposition values or the crop interception values that are used for the soil exposure assessment. So we want them to be harmonised between the exposure assessment done for soil organisms and those for the other non-target organisms. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, so I've already mentioned the MAF and the MAF times FTWA factor. So for the single applications, you only use an FTWA factor, and that is identical to the value that was used in the 2009 guidance document. So you can see the equation there, and nothing has changed. So the FTWA factor for those substances that meet the criteria, according to what Emily has presented in the previous presentation, that the FTWA factor can be used. Now, it's a bit more complicated for substances where you have multiple applications. So we need, in that case, we need to use a multiple application factor. And for the acute, there's an equation given in the guidance document, and it's identical to the MAF 90 from the EFSA 2009 guidance. And for the MAF repro, the difference is that we want to, it needs to be merged with the TWA factor. So in some cases, taking a MAF repro and an FTWA factor was producing under conservative exposure estimates. And that was in the case that you have multiple applications over a short period of time. So to resolve that issue, the working group has recommended that you take a MAF times FTWA factor that cannot be simply calculated by a multiplication. It needs to be resolved in an iterative process. But not to panic for that, because the calculator tool will calculate the MAF times FTWA factor, both individually, if you just want to find that factor out, and part of the overall assessment. And the purpose of the moving window TWA factor is to identify the worst case average exposure concentration following those applications. Now, the default DT50 value for all food items to be used in both the MAF and the FTWA factor is 10 days, and that is remained the same from the previous guidance document. So there's no change there. So we are continuing to use the DT50 value of 10 days for all food items. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, I think, okay, so this slide is to tell you about a new aspect of the exposure assessment. And that is the need to consider some generic model species in the off-crop area. So as part of the detailed consideration of which generic model species need to be considered in the in-crop area, it turns out that there are 3 groups of small mammal species that at some growth stages are only present in the off-crop. So they're not present in crop at certain growth stages. But that does not mean that there will be no exposure, because of course there can be spray drift. So what we have done is we've introduced an off-crop assessment for these animals. And because off-crop field margin has different interpretations for various people, we've introduced a new terminology because it really doesn't matter for our assessment. So what we've said is that animals are living in the terrestrial area of interest. Yeah, I've just been prompted to be a bit faster, so I will have to speed up a bit. Sorry for that. Okay, so the animals living in the terrestrial area of interest need to be considered, but because there will always be some exposure in field to birds and mammals, we took a very simplified approach. We simply said, correct the application rate by the spray drift value and use that in the standard tier 1 equations. So it's very simple and easy to do. Okay, and for those selecting those spray drift values, they are given in Appendix I, and they are clarified for those 62 crop groups that I've discussed earlier. And of course, in the generic model species Annex B spreadsheet that I presented earlier, there is another worksheet giving you the generic model species you need to consider for the TIE risk assessment. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so seed treatments, tier 1. First of all, I should explain that there is no screening step for seed treatments, so we don't have an indicator species. We jump straight to the tier 1 assessment. And you can see in this equation, it's identical to that considered in 2009. And I've grayed out the parameters I've already discussed. So the only difference between the spray application and for seed treatments is for the concentration on the food item. And I will come on to that later on, how we calculate that. So next slide, please. Okay, so selecting the generic model species for seed treatments, primarily they are split into 2 groups: those that are consuming the seeds, the treated seeds directly, and those generic model species that are consuming the germinating seeds that are seedlings that are growing from those treated seeds. The generic model species for the seeds consuming animals are dependent on the seed size, whereas the generic model species for the germinating seedlings are aligned to the generic model species for spray applications at early growth stages for the same crop. Sorry, there's some interruptions. Okay, and then so for selecting the generic model species, you can go back to the Annex B and you will find a separate spreadsheet summarising all the generic model species you need to consider, both for birds and mammals, for seed treatments. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so as I mentioned, the only difference between seed treatments and sprays is how you calculate the concentration on the food item. So the concentration on the treated seed is very easy because it's specified in the gap. So that's very easy to take and you can use it directly. The concentration value for the germinating seedlings is actually identical to the value that was used, or the approach that was used in the EFSA 2009 guidance. So we just use a dilution factor of 5, but you will find in Appendix M that there was an exercise to verify that that dilution factor was correct. And then for both types of generic model species, the concentration on the other food items is assumed to be 0. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, just very quickly here, the FTWA for seed treatments. Of course, we don't have a MAF value for seed treatments, but we do have an FTWA. The only difference for the treated seed is that we have clarified that the averaging period should indeed be 21 days. And that has caused some confusion in the past, so it's good to have some clarity. But there is no default value at the time of drafting for treated seeds, so that can only be used in the Tier 2 assessment. But for germinating seedlings, what we did is we worked out a surrogate FTWA factor that was based on growth dilution, and if you're interested, you can find out how that was done in Appendix M. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, very quickly for the Tier 2 exposure refinement for sprays. For the RUDs, it's a similar approach to what was already in the EFSA 2009 guidance document. So if you have new residue data, you can add it to the residue database and derive new acute RUD values, or 90th percentile RUD values, or geometric mean RUD values. However, considering the size of the sample size, adding a few extra values to the database is unlikely to have a large impact on those RUD values. However, where it might have an impact is, as I mentioned before, where we've had to use a surrogate value for the crop and the weed seeds, and also for flower buds it was necessary to use a surrogate value. Okay, next slide please. So for the refinement of the initial residues for seed treatments, yes, this can be done, but for the seedlings, it's important that the residue study is done at early growth stages. So we need to make sure that we're capturing the peak residue value. So next slide, please. Okay, in addition to refining the RUD values, you can also refine the DT50, both for exposure for seed treatments and spray applications. There is an annex which is provided in the guidance document for how to perform these residue studies and how to treat the data. That annex is aligned to the B guidance document because it's a cross-cutting issue, so we want it to be harmonised. The DT50 value should be refined for each of the food items separately, and then they can be used to recalculate the acute MAF and or the FTWA times MAF value for the reproductive assessment. Next slide, please. Maybe that's the end. Yes, now I've finished, a little bit over.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Rachel, for the for taking us through the Tier 1, Tier 2 part of the exposure assessment. On this part, we have 2 questions received from our registered participants, and the first of them for you is exposure to all types of birds and mammals will occur in the off-field area. Why does the scheme not cover exposure to birds and other mammals?
Okay, yeah, thank you for the question. It's a good one. For the other types of generic model species, they will never not be exposed in the in-crop area. So there's no need to consider them in the off-crop area, because the relative exposure in the off-crop area, or the TAI, the terrestrial area of interest, will always be significantly lower than for the in-crop area. So there was just no need. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And the next slide, please, for the next question. So from the person submitting the question, they do not understand why there are no shortcut values provided for the ecological scenarios as in the previous guidance document. This would ease daily work and also allow to verify that the calculator output is correct. In the opinion of the person submitting the question, this is needed for reasons of transparency and pragmatism. Rachel.
Okay, thank you for the question. Indeed, you're not the first person to suggest that. So we received comments during the public consultation on the draft guidance, specifically from member states requesting that the shortcut values were included for their extrapolation and the risk envelope approach. So I will just quickly show you how to do that. So if you go to the next slide, please, Laura. Okay, so like I say, the calculator tool will perform all the calculations, so we didn't think it was necessary, but the member states did want it. And what we have done is we have calculated an acute DD or a reproductive DDD for a single application for all 62 crop groups, and for those growth stages. An FTWA was not applied to those calculations, but it's not necessary for a risk envelope. So when you're comparing relative exposure, it wasn't necessary. So you can find these acute DD and reproductive DDD in Annex E of the guidance document, and you can filter for your crop and your generic model species, so you can compare the relative exposure between the 2 crops that you are trying to perform your risk envelope approach for. And we think that this will replace the need for shortcut values. And I think I can close my answer there. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. And the next question, please.
Oh, that's it.
That's it, isn't it? Yes. Wanting more questions than we have. So thank you very much, our presenters, for this first part of our session. Also for doing your best to keep us to time with a very, very full agenda and a large amount of information to be shared. We will come back for 15:30, so a very quick 6-minute comfort break, when we'll start again with our Tier 3 exposure assessment to continue with that. So thank you all and see you very soon. Dear participants, welcome back. And we kick off straight away with our continuation on the exposure assessment. We move now to tier 3. Theo, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Am I already? Yes. The next slide, please. As explained already, in Tier 3 exposure assessments, focal species are considered. That are real bird and mammal species that actually occur in the crop and differentiated according with the feeding guild. The potential feeding guild or guilds of focal species to consider is of course informed by lower tiers. The focal species selected for the risk assessment should be sufficiently protective of other animals with the same particular feeding guild of the focal species. And usually this will be the representative with the lowest body weight. In addition, focal species should be sufficiently prevalent, abundant in the fields with the relevant growth stage of the crop and the relevant geographical location of interest. Furthermore, in selecting the relevant focal species, it should be kept in mind that feeding guild of a focal species may change during the year. Note that the items that receive more attention in the revised new guidance document than in the previous guidance documents are indicated in red letterings in my slides. So may I have the next slide, please? This slide presents the data and study requirements to determine focal species. Information on European bird and mammal species that occur in agricultural landscapes can be found in the report of Lahr et al. But note that the list provided by Lahr et al. Is non-exhaustive and that regionally specific species may need to be considered. Field studies, for instance, based on transect counts, capture mark recapture techniques, radio tracking and camera traps can be used to determine focal species. But note that a sufficient number of sites, at least 20, should be visited and the landscape characteristics well described. Published data also may be used to determine focal species, but in that case a systematic review is required, particularly to evaluate the relevance and reliability of these data. Note that data in the open literature unfortunately often lack sufficient detail, and that landscape characteristics of old studies may differ from contemporary landscapes. Studies to determine focal species should be evaluated according to the critical appraisal tool for ecological studies. More information on this tool will be provided later on. Please be aware that in the final selection of focal species by regulatory authorities, the frequency of occurrence is not considered as important as feeding guild, body weight, and diet composition. The next slide, please. A frequently used Tier 3 exposure assessment is the refinement of PT. That is the assessment of the proportion of an animal's diet obtained in the infield area of the crop with the relevant growth stage under evaluation. Assumptions in the PT assessment are that the PT estimate is equal to the proportion of active time individuals of a relevant focal species spent in the in-field area, relative to that in all habitats of the farmland, and that this active time reasonably can be linked to foraging. Consequently, inactive data such as resting and hiding and observed non-feeding activities, for instance singing and nest building, should be excluded in estimating the PT. Please note that PT may be refined in the reproductive dietary exposure assessment, but not in the acute dietary exposure assessment. Furthermore, PT refinement is not an option for small mammals that predominantly occur in the so-called tie habitats, the area outside the cropped area that is treated with the pesticide where small mammals predominantly may dwell. And these areas may then become exposed via, for instance, spray drift. Daily PT values for a specific focal species and a specific crop can, amongst other, be estimated by radio tracking, thermal imaging, and/or GPS tracking. But note that these daily PT values may show inter- and intra-individual variation, as well as variation between agricultural landscapes and seasons. The next slide, please. Several requirements are described in the updated guidance document for valid PT studies. A new requirement is that PT studies should be evaluated using the critical appraisal tool for ecological field studies. Furthermore, a justification must be provided for focal species and study site selection, and ideally, this selection process is discussed in advance with the member state competent authority. Similar to the previous guidance document, individuals of the relevant focal species used for tracking are preferably captured in or in close proximity of the crop of interest. And for a realistic worst-case proxy of daily activity, nocturnal species need to be tracked at night, diurnal species during daylight, or dependent on the habits of the species all day long. Next slide, please. Preferably, multiple PT sessions with the same individual are conducted for several days, not necessarily consecutive, and the distinction is made between confirmed consumer individuals and potential consumer individuals. Confirmed consumer individuals are individuals actually foraging in-field during at least one tracking session. So the PT is in that case larger than 0. Potentially consumer individuals are individuals with a PT larger than 0 for at least one daily activity period, supplemented with individuals captured and are observed shortly before tagging in the crop and that have a PT of 0. Also in the case of multiple sessions. I come back to these two groups later. May I have the next slide? This slide and the next slide present the decision scheme for PT refinement as presented in the updated guidance document. Under A, if for the relevant focal species for less than 10 confirmed consumer individuals, a daily PT value is available, then an additional PT study is required, or expert judgment is used to decide whether the highest empirical daily PT value or the upper bound of the 19th percentile of the PT values can be used. Under B, if for the relevant focal species for less than 20 individuals, empirical daily PT values for confirmed consumers are available, then the median of the 19th percentile of the mean daily PT values of these confirmed consumers is used, irrespective whether they are obtained from single or multiple sessions. And under C, this section of the decision scheme concerns the question whether sufficient proof is presented for preference of the focal species to forage in the relevant growth stage of the crop, and whether the study area is strongly representative of the area where the plant protection product will be used. If this question can be answered positively, then potential consumer individuals can be selected for the PT refinement. If not, confirmed consumers need to be selected. Next slide, please. Under D, if potential consumer individuals can be used for the PT assessment, and for more than 10 individuals, empirical daily PT values are available for repeated sessions, and the reproductive dietary exposure assessment allows the use of the time-weighted average factor, then Monte Carlo simulation can be used to calculate a virtual 21-day 19th percentile PT, using mean daily PT values of potential consumer individuals as pooled data. If the above is not the case, then the empirical median 19th percentile PT is selected using observed individual mean daily PT values of potential consumers as input. And under E, then in principle the same procedure as described under D can be used, but now based on consumer individuals only. Note that in the decision scheme, the different empirical daily PT values of repeated sessions with the same individual a priori are not considered as independent. That is why in Monte Carlo simulations, the mean daily PT value for each individual is proposed. To demonstrate independence of daily PT values of repeated sessions with the same individual, and to use these independent daily PT values in Monte Carlo simulations, appropriate technical guidance still needs to be developed, and that may be an important activity for the near future. The next slide, please. Another Tier 3 exposure assessment is the refinement of PD. PD concerns the composition of the diet obtained from the area containing a sufficient coverage of the crop growth stage of interest. Again, as was the case in the PT assessment, PD can be refined in the reproductive dietary exposure assessment, but not in the acute dietary exposure assessment, while also appropriate focal species and field study sites need to be identified. Please note that for seed treatments, only PD or PT can be refined, but not both, to avoid double counting. Usually, the PT is considered more reliable, For further details on this topic, please I refer to box 2 on page 76 of the new guidance document. The next slide, please. For PD refinement, the diet of the focal species selected can be estimated by means of video recordings and/or investigating excrements and stomach content. However, the representativeness of the methods to assess diet composition and the data evaluation to derive a refined PD needs to be motivated. A new recommendation is that the distribution and amount of relevant food items in the field study sites need to be assessed as well. The relevant food items to monitor depend on the feeding guild of the focal species selected. So for an insectivorous animal, it will be insects. And for a granivorous bird, the seeds. Finally, study design, field location, and number of trapped and tagged animals, duration of trapping sessions, individual PD values, etc., should be reported in detail, including technical limitations of the selected approach. Next slide, please. This slide presents the decision scheme for PD refinement as presented in the updated guidance document. Under A, if for less than 10 individuals of the relevant focal species valid PD values are available, either an additional PD study is required or expert judgment is used to decide whether to use the PD value inducing the highest exposure from all individuals. Under B, if for at least 10 individuals but less than 20 individuals of the relevant focal species valid PD values are available, the PD values inducing the highest exposure from all individuals is used. However, if for more than 20 individuals valid PD values are made available, then the geometric mean PD value from all individuals can be used. Next slide, please. Now I give the floor to Emily for further details on the integrated exposure and effect assessment here.
Great. Thank you so much, Theo. As Theo mentioned, I'm responsible now for taking you through the highest tier of the risk assessment, and that would be the integrated exposure and effect tier. So EFSA 2009 did not provide much specific information on performing or evaluating these types of data, but rather provided a summary or sketch of the prevailing thoughts and methods at the time, for example, for field effect studies. This was something that was noted in the stakeholder consultation prior to the revision. And this relative lack of specificity has resulted, next slide, please. This relative lack of specificity has resulted in relative lack of acceptance of field effect studies or inconsistent acceptance of them over time or between different authorities. The working group has attempted in the update of the guidance to provide more clear and consistent guidance, both on how such studies might be performed, including not only possible methods, but pros and cons of those methods for different endpoints, and also better guidance to regulators on how to evaluate the quality of such studies and consider them in the risk assessment. In order to do this, the working group used data that was submitted during the revision and data from hearing experts to develop these information. It remains the case, as in EFSA 2009, that field effect studies should be considered in the context of all of the available data. Next slide, please. So in order to provide some guidance to regulators as well as study directors and monitors, the working group also attempted to provide information on evaluation of field effect studies. These include the CATs, which were mentioned by Theo earlier, and a possible MDD consideration, basically ranking different effect levels into different categories. Note that the statistical considerations used may be according to Brock et al., but other methodologies, for example, Mayer et al. And considered.
Hi, Emily, we're losing you again.
In addition, oh, okay. I will turn off my camera.
Thank you.
So are we on the next slide? Potentially. So in addition, the working group updated the types of data and endpoints that might be collected in both acute and reproduction field effect studies, as well as giving pros and cons to these methods and endpoints for different cases. Again, these sections were based significantly on data submitted to the working group by experts in the conduct of field studies, as well as experience gained since the implementation of EFSA 2009. In addition, they were significantly updated after the commenting period based on comments from stakeholders and additional data submitted in hearings. Next slide. Finally, the section on pen studies in EFSA 2009 was also updated, and it's now called enclosure studies. And examples are given of enclosure studies and the endpoints which may be derived using enclosure studies. It is noted in this section, as was also in the field effects studies section, that these studies may be particularly useful in combination with modeling. A significantly updated section on the use of modeling in the birds and mammal risk assessment is included in the guidance, with information on evaluating modeling studies, as well as performing such studies and how they may influence uncertainty, which is the next topic of discussion today. So next slide, please. So an important factor in the higher tier assessments is an assessment of the uncertainty in the risk assessment. Next slide. And of course, the making of a weight of evidence conclusion. So the guidance summarizes a concept which can be confusing at times, which is the difference between variability and uncertainty. This section in the Birds and Mammals guidance is itself a summary of the more expansion discussion of this topic in the EFSA guidance on uncertainty, just added to help with this rather confusing concept. Next slide. So in addition, the guidance lists overarching uncertainties which are not covered even by the Tier 1 assessment in order to provide context to the regulator considering the uncertainty assessment and the weight of evidence. So this is just a list of some of those which are listed in the revised guidance document and were also mentioned by Theo in the introduction section. Next slide, please. It's important to emphasize that the uncertainty assessment is performed by the regulator and not by the applicant, and it's performed specifically for the higher tiers. As we know, in higher tiers, a more realistic consideration of exposure and/or effect, or both, is made, which may decrease uncertainty under specific circumstances, but also increase uncertainty in extrapolation outside of those circumstances, as is shown in this figure from the guidance. It is emphasized that the point of the uncertainty analysis and weight of evidence conclusions is to better communicate to risk managers the outcome of the risk assessment, including the scope of the risk assessment, to allow them to make better registration and mitigation decisions. Next slide. So to assist the regulatory risk assessor in this communication, 2 example tables have been included in the guidance. The first, a bit of which is shown here, is a point-by-point table describing the higher tier information, the uncertainties inherent to the specific higher tier refinement, and what these might mean for the risk assessment, and also how these were used in the risk assessment. Next slide, please. The other table is the weight of evidence conclusion table, which presents the risk assessor's conclusions about the risk assessment as to the scope, meaning what is the range covered in the location, season, etc., and where the risk assessment is too uncertain to be able to be considered acceptable. In this example, the data and its overall quality are summarized, as well as how the data is used in the risk assessment and what this means for the uncertainty and extrapolation to different risk assessment areas. A final conclusion lays out the assessor's conclusion as to what is covered and potentially not covered by the risk assessment. And these tables are again populated with a fictitious example to provide guidance on the types of information that can be included or should be included by the regulators. And I think with that, that was my last slide before the questions for this section. So I'll give the floor back to you, Tobin.
Thank you very much, Emily, and also to Theo for your presentations on this section. We have received 3 questions from our registered participants relating to the material that you just presented. And the first of these is to you, Emily. So for field studies, guidance on how to conduct and evaluate them for use in the risk assessment is unclear. What are the next steps to add clarity? Please.
Okay, great. Well, I'm somewhat surprised by this question, actually, because as I mentioned in my presentation, we've attempted to add significantly more guidance than was available in the 2009 version of the guidance, including the development of critical appraisal tools to harmonize evaluation of such studies and to allow those planning the studies to determine what factors may be important to regulators when planning and also when reporting the studies. And as you can see, here are the different CATs that are available for higher tier studies, from the tier 2 residue studies through the tier 3 and tier 4 studies, and also links to where you can find those CAT tools. And in addition to the CATs, we've also provided specific information for each type of field study as to the most important factors to consider when planning and evaluating field data, and addressed issues which were already creating difficulties or disharmonization in field studies, including, for example, the 21-day PT and issues surrounding focal species studies, such as season, feeding guild, categorization, extrapolation, etc. And for field effect studies, we've attempted to provide examples of endpoints to be measured to address different issues in the lower tier risk assessment, as well as giving guidance as to the levels of effect that might be considered by regulators in these studies. In addition, we've attempted to provide clarity on the various uncertainties which regulators consider when evaluating effect field studies, as well as information on how to combine field effect studies with other types of studies, as I mentioned, such as enclosure studies and modeling, in order to address some of these areas of uncertainty. It must be noted that under the previous guidance, for example, field effect studies were barely accepted, and we attempt to ameliorate this to some degree by providing better and more specific guidance in the update. So generally, we believe that the information on conducting and evaluating field studies is improved compared to the previous version of the guidance, but we don't exclude, of course, that further development is possible. And as with any update, experience will be necessary in order to see how the new recommendations and guidance provided work in real life. And the only way to do that is to use it. Thanks, Tobin.
Excellent. Thank you very much for those clarifications, Emily. The next question we have is for you, Theo. So will PT and PD refinements be still possible based on open literature?
My answer will be quite short. Open literature data may be used for PT and PD refinement, but then, of course, a systematic review should be performed, and an evaluation of the reliability and relevance of the data obtained is still required. And then I refer back to the critical appraisal tool discussed by Emily in the previous slides. Particularly, the PT and PD data of the open literature should be, of course, relevant for the selected focal species and the crop stage under evaluation. Furthermore, as I mentioned already in a previous slide, landscape characteristics of old study in open literature may deviate too much from contemporary landscapes. And unfortunately, often open literature data lack sufficient detail. So in future publications, that detail should be transparently be provided. That is my answer, Toby.
Excellent. Thank you, Theo. Very clear. And then the third and final question on this particular section, again for you, Theo. How do models fit with the new guidance document? Is it more likely that they will be accepted by regulatory authorities?
So in the updated guidance document, more attention is paid to mechanistic effect models, such as effect assessment, Tier 2, TK and TK-TD modeling, as well as population models as possible tools for the integrative exposure and assessment tier. Although these modeling approaches for birds and mammals in the era of pesticides are mainly a research activity to date, they are considered promising to further improve regulatory era. It is anticipated that the standardized regulatory use of TK, TK-TD and population models requires the development of technical guidance. This still has to be done. Furthermore, the regulatory use of population models in particular requires the development and selection of environmental scenarios that are sufficiently worst case. Please note that EFSA has set up a standing working group for the evaluation of effect models, and the kick-off meeting will be held in May 2023. For the time being, the interpretation of results of these modeling exercises and their use in regulatory era needs to be done on a case-by-case basis and expert judgment, but when technical guidance is developed, this can be done in a more harmonized way. Yeah, that's what I can say. So I hope that was clear enough.
Thank you, Theo. Very good. Also, thank you for that update on some of the follow-up actions that will bring further clarity in this area. Very useful. So we move now to the final session, in many ways, of this afternoon's information session, where we will be presenting additional key changes from, if you like, the remaining chapters 8 through to 15. And already, Theo, I invite you back to take us through the first of these sections on chapter 10 on secondary poisoning.
Thank you, Toad. The next slide, please. Secondary poisoning results from food web transfer of pollutants when one organism ingests another organism that has contaminant in its system. To trigger the assessment of secondary poisoning, the pesticide and/or its metabolite must have a log KOW equal or larger than 3. And that was the same, I think, in other guidance documents. In the updated guidance document, 3 different routes of secondary poisoning are considered. For the terrestrial compartment, the route of earthworm-eating birds and mammals, and for the aquatic compartment, the routes of fish-eating birds and mammals, and the route of benthic invertebrate-eating birds and mammals. The first 2 routes were already part of the previous guidance document, while the latter route is new. The next slide, please. So, 2 approaches for the Tier 1 assessment of secondary poisoning for earthworm-eating birds and mammals are described in the updated guidance document. The pore water approach and the dry soil approach. In the new guidance document, the poor water approach is recommended, but requires that soil guidance published in 2017 is officially implemented by the European Commission, and this implementation process, by the way, is well underway, so it is expected to occur soon. On this slide, an overview of the poor water approach is presented. For the decision low risk, the toxicity exposure ratio should be equal or larger than 5. The effect part of this ratio is the reproductive endpoint of the standard test species, already discussed, while the exposure part of this ratio is the daily dose of the predicted concentrations in the earthworm that is used as food. The daily dose PEC earthworm is calculated with the equations presented on this slide. Please note that the values for the parameters in green are fixed and provided in the guidance document, such as food intake rate and body weight of the generic model species and the fraction of water, lipids, and gut loading in earthworms, as well as the raw earthworm, that is the bulk density of the worm. The KOW value is, of course, substance specific. A new requirement in the updated guidance document is that for the predicted environmental concentration in pore water and total soil, the highest 7-day time-weighted average PEC value are used. This is a conservative but also a pragmatic approach, accounting for the lack of information on the time needed for reaching steady state conditions of the substance between the organism and the environment. Next slide, please. If the pore water approach cannot be used yet, but hopefully very soon, the dry soil approach can be used in the secondary poisoning assessment for earthworm-eating birds and mammals. This approach is similar as described in the previous guidance document, except that now the highest 7-day time-weighted average PEC value for total soil is used in the equation. And that it is recommended to use the geometric mean KOC value, if available, that is also used in exposure modeling. The next slide, please. Again, in the risk assessment of secondary poisoning for fish-eating birds and mammals, the toxicity exposure ratio should be equal or larger than 5 to conclude low risks. In this TER, the toxicity estimate is again the reproductive endpoint for the standard test species of bird or mammal, while the exposure estimate is the daily dose predicted environmental concentration in fish for the selected generic model species of bird and mammal. This daily dose, PEC fish, is the food intake rate divided by the body weight of the generic model species multiplied with the time-weighted average predicted concentration in surface water, and that's multiplied again with the bioconcentration factor of fish, times the estimated biomagnification factor. And that estimated biomagnification factor is a new element in the updated guidance document. And it is obtained in the table presented here on this slide, and that's also part of the new guidance. Note that for the time-weighted average PEC surface water, a period of 7 to 21 days, based on the exact time period will be based on expert judgment, is recommended. This period should be aligned to the time required for the substance reaching equilibrium in the fish BCF, the bioconcentration factor study. Next slide, please. The Tier 1 approach for secondary poisoning of benthic invertebrate-eating birds and mammals resembles in fact the pore water approach for earthworm-eating birds and mammals, but now the earthworm is replaced by the aquatic oligogate Lumbriculus variegatus. And of course, the generic model species are used that mimic wetland species of birds and mammals. Again, for predicted environmental concentrations in pore water and total sediment, the highest 7-day time-weighted average PEC values are suggested. The next slide, please. In the revised guidance document, the Tier 1 approach for secondary poisoning is described in detail. Higher tier approaches are described in general terms only. Possible Tier 2 approaches for refining secondary poisoning concern refinement of the predicted environmental concentrations in soil, surface water or sediment, replacing the estimated bioconcentration factor and estimated biomagnification factor by experimentally derived values, and by applying TK or TKTD modeling approaches for estimating the predicted environmental concentrations in the organisms. Possible Tier 3 approaches concern the identification of more realistic region-specific focal species of bird or mammals, and refinement of the PT and PD of this region-specific focal species. Possible Tier 4 approach concerns food chain modeling. So the next slide, please. I give now the floor to Rachel to for further details on metabolite risk assessment for birds and mammals.
Thank you very much, Taylor. Okay, yes, for the next section, I'm going to discuss some extra aspects of the guidance document. So not all of it, but some of the key changes from the remaining chapters. So for metabolites, so next slide, please. I thought we'd start off with the easy ones. So for the metabolites in soil and water. So those are easy for us because they are assessed by the fate and behaviour assessment. So all we need to do is consider those metabolites that they've identified as needing further consideration in the ecotox risk assessment, which is usually included in the list of endpoints. And then for the assessment of birds and mammals, we simply need to consider whether those metabolites have a log KOW of greater than 3 to see whether they trigger a secondary poisoning assessment. Okay, next slide. But what about metabolites in plants, insects, seeds and fruit? Well, for the plants, we can use the residue information. So just as we have been doing up till now, we can use the information that's contained in the section B7 of the RA. And to be honest, we will not end up with information on metabolites in insects and seeds. And therefore we have to extrapolate. So one of the pragmatic decisions is that we will assume the same metabolites in insects and seeds that we find in the plants. Okay, so what was I going to say? So for the plant metabolites, we can use the information in the RA, and that information is the metabolism studies, which give us the nature of the residue field trials, which give us the magnitude of the residue, and then the rotational crop field trials, which will tell us what residues are occurring in the rotational or succeeding crops. And we have said that it is necessary to perform a risk assessment for birds and mammals for plant metabolites, for those metabolites that occur at greater than 10% TRR, so applied radioactivity, and they must meet both criteria, and they must occur at greater than 0.01 milligrams per kilogram. But for which plant parts do you need to look? Well, this is summarised in table 21 of the guidance documents. I won't go through it now because it's quite long and time is tight. So next slide, please. So what do you do for your risk assessment? Well, before you actually think about doing a quantitative risk assessment for the metabolites that you need to consider, the first step is to look at and see whether those metabolites occur in the animal metabolism studies. So you can consider the rat and the hen metabolism studies to see whether those metabolites occur at a substantial or significant occurrence, and that occurrence would need to be above 10% of the applied dose for them to be considered covered by the toxicity data with the parent. And if indeed that they are occurring at greater than 10%, then you can assume that the risk assessment for the parent is also covering the metabolite. But for those metabolites where you need to perform a quantitative exposure assessment and risk assessment, we can consider the acute risk assessment and the reproductive assessment separately. So for the acute risk assessment, first of all, you need to identify what toxicity data you're going to use. In the case that you have toxicity data, then of course that you should use that for the risk assessment. But in the vast majority of cases, you will not have that for the initial risk assessment, and therefore it's necessary to use a surrogate value. And that surrogate value is simply taking the toxicity endpoint for the parent and dividing it by 10. So assuming that the metabolite is 10 times more toxic than the parent. And then in terms of your exposure estimate, well, it's calculated in exactly the same way as for the parent substance, except the RUD for the metabolite, so the residue value for the metabolite, is extrapolated from the parent value, but by multiplying it by QMET. So once you've performed your risk assessment, the same assessment factor should be applied. But what is the QMET value? So next slide, please. So QMET stands for amount of metabolite, and it can be established from the metabolism studies by taking the highest concentration of the metabolite, expressed as parent equivalent, but normalized by a 1 kilogram application, or by considering the highest percentage total recovered radioactivity. So that would be the percentage TRR divided by 100. So first of all, you should assume the same QMET value for all food items. So just use the highest percentage TRR recovered for all the relevant food items to derive one single QMET value to be used in the risk assessment. And that can be used in the initial risk assessment and refined later if necessary. Retrieving the information from the residue value, residue section to establish the QMET, then you should check all the available metabolism studies for primary and rotational crops. Okay, next slide, please. And then for the moving on to the reproductive risk assessment. So at this point, we need to be a bit pragmatic because metabolites are not always causing issues for birds and mammals, but we need to be aware that some metabolites occasionally are much more toxic, and we need to be able to screen out those metabolites that are not an issue and make sure we do an assessment for where there is an issue. So in the vast majority of cases, the primary default position is that you will not need to do a reproductive assessment for metabolites. It's not warranted. However, what I'm trying to say here is that we should not close our eyes. We've got to be a bit pragmatic and use a common sense approach, and we should consider the toxicological profile of that metabolite to all non-target organisms and in the mammalian toxicology package. Is there anything that's raising concern? If yes, then we need to use our expert judgment to trigger the need for a reproductive assessment for that metabolite. But like I say, that the default position is that we assume that we will not need to do such assessment. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I think I've said everything I wanted to say for metabolites. So now I'm going to discuss a little bit about the risk assessment for the plant protection products, so for the actual formulation. So next slide, please. Okay, so we'll start off simple. So formulations or plant protection products with a single application, single active substance. In the majority of cases, you will not have any formulation toxicity data. We need to remember now that we're trying to avoid any additional vertebrate testing. So we need to be a bit pragmatic and use what information we do have and try to use our expert judgment. However, for some cases, we will have acute toxicity data in the mammalian toxicology package. And in that case, you should consider that data and see whether it's posing or indicating an increase in toxicity relative to that you expect for the active substance alone. And to do that, we use a factor of 3. And so if it's less than a factor of 3, then there's no need to consider it. And you can assume that the risk assessment for the active substance is also covering the product. However, in the case that the formulation is more toxic, then what do you do? So in that case, for the area of the assessment that you have the toxicity data, so I'm assuming it's going to be the acute mammalian toxicity area of the assessment, so toxicity data, you can perform the assessment for the product using that data. But what do you do with the birds? So what we are saying here is just to see how much the increase in toxicity is of the product relative to the active substance for the mammals, and derive a correction factor, and that correction factor should be applied to the avian risk assessment as well. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so that was the assessment for single active formulations, but what do you do with multiple active substance in a formulation? So this, the default approach should be used when there are no toxicity data available, or when the mixture is not showing any synergistic effects. And the default approach is the sum of the toxic units, and this is where we assume dose addition. So in the context of risk assessment, what we've suggested that this is done is that we can actually do this for the TER, not for the toxicity value, but for the TER. So this would be this is the so-called combi TER approach. And here you can see how you sum the toxic units for the TER. Okay, next slide. But what should you do when you have data? So the data informed approach. Well, first of all, you should check whether the dose addition holds true. So is it really appropriate to assume that the sum of those toxic units are just addition and there's no synergistic effects? So what we can do to do this is we can use a dose addition model, or sometimes referred to as the Finney equation, and calculate an endpoint for the mixture. And you can see that equation here. So next slide, please. So once you have the endpoint for the mixture, you can then divide that endpoint by your experimental endpoints. So the predicted endpoint divided by the experimental endpoint. And that will give you something called the model deviation ratio, the MDR. Now, if the MDR is less than 3, then we are assuming that the dose addition is confirmed and your mixture is no more toxic than additive. If the MDR is less than 0.33, then we cannot exclude antagonistic effects. However, for the purposes of the risk assessment, it's still reasonable to perform the risk assessment assuming the default approach, so the COMB-TER as I described before. Now, if in the case you have an MDR of greater than 3, the mixture is assumed to be more toxic, or in fact it's proven to be more toxic. Okay, so next slide, please. So what to do in the case that your mixture is in fact more toxic? Then you can correct your COMB-TER by that model deviation factor, so the model deviation ratio, so the MDR. So you can just correct the calculation using the MDR and see what the outcome of the assessment is. If you only have an MDR available for mammals, probably very likely for the acute mammals, then the same MDR that you've derived for the mammals should also be applied to the bird risk assessment, and if necessary it can also be applied to the reproductive risk assessment. So there's another pragmatic decision that had to be taken there to avoid vertebrate testing. Okay, next slide please. And I move to my final few slides, which is on chapter 8, which is for the granular plant protection products. So those formulations that are applied as granules. Next slide, please. So I will not go through the entire risk assessment for granular products in this info session because it would take an entire info session to do so. That is quite complicated, and there are various routes that need to be considered. Furthermore, it hasn't changed substantially from the risk assessment procedure in the EFSA 2009 guidance. So there isn't much change and much you need to learn in order to apply the new guidance. The most substantial change is that we have removed the need to consider the accidental ingestion of granules as part of soil intake by birds and mammals. And this is because when we looked into the literature, we found out that, or it was the working group's opinion, that we cannot exclude that birds and mammals will purposefully ingest soil, but in the vast majority of cases, it's a rare occurrence, and when it does occur, it happens to be by the larger animals. So we didn't think it was a primary source of exposure to birds and mammals for granular products. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so one further clarification that we have included in the guidance, based on the feedback we had from the member states in the first public consultation actually, is that they wanted us to consider what to do for those granules that are fast dissolving, so herbicidal granules that are applied and then usually followed by mandatory irrigation or other ways for the granules to dissolve. For the acute assessment, you should follow the standard approach for granules. That's because we cannot exclude that there will be direct exposure to the birds and mammals for the granules. But for the reproductive assessment, we think it's more akin to the spray application risk assessment. So we have clarified that you need to perform the reproductive assessment following the methodology for spray applications. To do that, you take the generic model species for the crop group, all field crops between 0 and 9, so the very early applications, almost bare soil. And you select the generic model species and perform the assessment in exactly the same way as for the spray applications. The only difference is for the estimation of the concentration on food. And there, for the ground arthropods and the weed seeds, you should just take the standard RUD values, so the oversprayed RUD values. But unfortunately, when I put this presentation together, I realized that there's an error in the guidance document. And you can see that in this table, the RUD values for the ground arthropods and the weed seeds have actually been switched. So that's something we should correct at some future point. And then for estimating the concentration on the residue in the germinating seedlings, so those are the residues in the germinating seedlings that have been treated with the granule. What we have suggested there is that you take the soil pore water concentration at 1 centimetre, and I've made reference to the section of the guidance document where you can find further information on how to do that. And then the standard FTWA factor may be used if your substance is meeting the criteria for considering FTWA in the risk assessment. Next slide, please. I think I might have finished. Okay, yes, then we can move on to the questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Rachel, and Theo as well for taking us through these final chapters. And from registered participants, we have 2 questions on these final chapters. The first one is for you, Rachel. So in the mixture toxicity section, what is the justification for the use of MDR greater than 3 to assume synergistic effects?
Okay. Okay, thanks. Okay, yes, it's a good question. So the MDR, the factor of 3 is derived from the European Commission guidance on technical, the equivalent of technical specifications, and in there it gives this factor of 3 that is the variability between laboratory studies in ecotoxicity tests. So it's the standard, it's the natural variability that you can expect if you tested a substance multiple times. So therefore, on that basis, what the working group thought was that if a factor of 3 is the natural variability, that anything above the natural variability is considered to be synergistic. Thanks.
Okay, very good, very clear. Then the second question we have is for you, Theo. And could you please clarify what depth of the PEX sediment should be used in the assessment of secondary poisoning via benthic invertebrates? The guidance indicates that it should be 1 centimetre, but it also indicates that it should be aligned to that assumed for the risk assessment of benthic invertebrates, which is currently 5 centimetres. Theo, please.
Focus Surface Water Repair has adopted the recommendations of the sediment opinion. So the 1 centimeter top layer will be used for PEX sediment calculations when focus surface water repair is implemented. And when so that is in the hands of the Commission, but it is hopefully it will not take a too long time. The implementation is anticipated to occur in the near future, and the scientific justification to use the top 1 centimeter instead of the top 5 centimeter is that the biomass of benthic organisms is also highest in the top layer of the sediment, where also organic matter, and that is the food for many benthic invertebrates, but also lipophilic pesticides accumulate. And in addition, also for benthic invertebrates that occur deeper in the sediment, they often feed on the upper one, the fluffy organic layer on the top of the sediment. So the exposure is largely via that top layer. Selecting the top 1 centimeter layer, however, is also based on some pragmatism, because in experiments and monitoring studies, this layer can be sampled to verify model predictions. Accurately sampling a top sediment layer smaller than 1 centimeter may be more difficult, since the top sediment layer may be quite fluffy. So it is more realistic, but also pragmatic. And I hope that is a suitable answer.
Thank you, Theo. I think we all like to hear pragmatic. That's always a good way to go. And with that, that brings us to the end of the presentation of the updates to this guidance document, also to the questions that we received during the registration phase. Just to summarize for you, with this guidance document, we feel that we have addressed our terms of reference, specifically asking us to update this guidance with relation to current regulations, to the latest developments in scientific research. We hope that it is somewhat simplified and clarified from the previous iteration. We hope that the recommendations will help with harmonisation, and indeed for all of these aspects, the inclusion of Member States experts into this process we think has been helpful, as well as the public consultations on this. And not to forget that part of this process has led to the production of our comprehensive calculator tool. And I take the opportunity to remind you that we have a demonstration session tomorrow at 10 o'clock. So we hope to see many, if not all of you at that session to see the tool in practice. Just a little practical note, in order to ensure that the tool works during the demonstration tomorrow, we'll be taking it offline this evening until after the end of tomorrow's demonstration, when it will be back online and available for all of you to use. Then the next slide, please. Thank you. So the next steps. So from EFSA's point of view, this is the update has been completed of our guidance document. It now passes to the hands of the risk managers, and specifically it will be considered in the PAF committee, the Standing Committee on Plants, Animal Food and Feed, where they will take the document into consideration and decide whether to officially take note of it. We of course sincerely hoping that that will be the case. If they do take notes, then you will have notification of the date from which this guidance document should be implemented. Our expectations will be that there'll be a reasonable lead-in period, of course, to allow applicants to adjust to the new guidance. So those are the next steps, and will in fact bring us to the end of this process for this current iteration of the guidance document. Of course, I'm sure there will be future updates to this at some point in the future. Again, for the very reasons why we updated this document, to take into account updates in regulation, in science, and ensure further harmonisation with other parts of our guidance and regulation. With that, it leaves me just to thank our three presenters from this afternoon session. I'm sure you will agree with me, they got through an awful lot of material in a very timely way. Me personally, I'm extremely impressed with, as you can see, getting through 131 slides in well under 3 hours. So my congratulations again to our three presenters for managing that very significant challenge. Also, my thanks to the backroom staff, of which there are quite a few, who have enabled both the setting up of this information session and particularly its smooth running today. As we mentioned right at the start of today's session, the recording will be available on EFSA's website in the coming days. Please take advantage of that to go back and see some of the material that was shared with you. As I say, a lot was shared, so that may well be useful for you and for colleagues who couldn't attend live to the meeting. And again, in a few minutes' time, maybe you will be receiving via email evaluation survey. Again, very important for us to have your feedback on what you feel of these information events. It helps us improve our service to you. Thank you all for your attention. Very happy to have so many of you with us today, and we look forward to having hopefully all of you with us tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. And with that, we are finished for today. Thank you.